The creepiest camping experience happened when my best friend and I decided to camp in a semi-remote area, reachable only by a 4x4 vehicle. It was a semi-maintained spot with a few fire pits, rotting picnic tables, and a rundown outhouse. The Park Service checked on it maybe once a year. We arrived and began setting up camp when my friend wandered over to the outhouse. He opened the door, stood there for a moment, then closed it and went to the second outhouse. After a few minutes, he came out and told me to go check out the first one. I assumed maybe someone had left a mess on the floor or an unfortunate animal had gotten trapped inside. But it was none of those things. Inside the first outhouse, we found 3 fully loaded backpacks. And I'm talking about big backpacks, like the ones I use for week-long trips. Curiosity got the best of us, so we decided to open them up. 2 of them were filled with good quality camping gear, which wasn't unusual. But the third backpack was a different story. It was packed to the brim with Skittles. Bulk bags, small bags, regular, tropical, sour, every flavor and size of Skittles imaginable. It was just bizarre. We camped there for 4 days and never saw a soul. When we left, the backpacks were still there. We made sure to inform the conservation officers about our discovery when we returned to civilization. Who had left all that gear? And why did one person pack 80 liters of Skittles? We'll never know, but it was definitely one of the weirdest experiences we've had. Oh, and there's another story. One time, I was backpacking with my dog on a spur-of-the-moment overnight trip. We weren't far from the road, and I had set up a small tarp shelter and a little fire. I wasn't exactly hiding, but I wasn't being very obvious either. I was just dozing off when I heard a truck roaring up, accompanied by a chorus of drunken voices. And then, the shooting started. Now, these folks probably didn't know I was there. I had parked on a different road, and I hadn't realized I had walked as close as I had to their location. But being in the vicinity when a group of inebriated folks was shooting off guns was far from comfortable. I leashed up my dog tightly and got out of there as fast as I could. Is there anything else you'd like me to do with this story or any other requests you have in mind? I was camping solo in a remote valley with no cell service. I had stayed out late on a trail, and as darkness fell, I encountered a friendly local guy. He graciously directed me to a hidden camping spot near the road and the river. It was quite concealed but convenient. I decided to set up a campfire, cracked open a beer, and tuned into my friend's comedy podcast. I was being a bit loud and visible, given the darkness. Instead of pitching my tent, I chose to sleep in the back of my truck under the topper, surrounded by all my gear. The next morning, I woke up, started a fire, popped another beer, and began preparing breakfast. That's when I noticed a man at the edge of my camp. He was gradually moving closer but never once looked directly at me. This guy looked homeless, with a long, scruffy beard, and he had what seemed like 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothing. Trying to be friendly, I remarked on the beautiful day. However, there was no response from him. I offered him some breakfast, but still, he said nothing. He sort of paced around the perimeter of my camp, not engaging with me. In an uncomfortable situation now, I extended my hospitality by offering him a beer. Yet again, he just turned around. The guy continued to stand there, with his back to me, aimlessly wandering around my campsite. I began to realize that this wasn't going to lead to anything good. I had my bear spray and buck knife within arm's reach. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I gave him an ultimatum. Listen, you're either going to acknowledge me or leave right now. Still, he ignored me. So I grabbed the bear mace and took a few steps toward him. He slinked away, and I hastily packed up my belongings into my truck, departing that place as quickly as I could. I couldn't help but wonder if he had been watching me during the night, and I couldn't be more thankful for my decision to sleep in my truck rather than in a tent. One crisp morning, my parents were abruptly awoken by an unusual commotion just outside their tent. In their groggy state, my dad struggled to make sense of the cacophony. The noise was unmistakably close, and before he could fully rouse himself, a surprising event occurred. The entire side of the tent closest to him collapsed, enveloping him in its folds. The abrupt weight on the tent lifted almost as swiftly as it had descended. Now fully alert, my parents hastily unzipped the tent flap, anxious to unravel the mystery of this bizarre occurrence. To their astonishment, they found themselves face to face with a spooked black bear, its expression a mix of confusion and concern as it stared back at the collapsed tent. After a series of stern shouts, the bear, apparently equally startled by the situation, hastily retreated into the wilderness. Upon reflection, we deduced that the bear had been foraging in the thick underbrush just behind our tent, and in a moment of unexpected misfortune, had lost its footing. Thus, my dad could now humorously claim that he had, quite literally, been sat on by a bear. My siblings and I embarked on a camping trip that led us into a spine-tingling encounter with nature's fury. It all began with an incredibly powerful storm that swept through the area. Lightning bolts relentlessly slammed into the lake, creating an awe-inspiring, continuous display of electricity dancing across the darkened skies. The thunder roared without end, and the wind howled as if possessed. The tempest's intensity grew to the point where we feared for our safety inside our tent. It felt as if the tent might take flight at any moment. With trepidation, we abandoned our shelter and sought refuge in the car. From the relative safety of our vehicle, we watched in shock as our tent collapsed and was carried away by the ferocious winds, ending up entangled in a nearby tree. The car, too, trembled under the relentless onslaught of the storm. Fearful for our lives, we made the decision to evacuate, driving roughly 20 minutes to my grandpa's house, where we hoped to find sanctuary from the tempest's fury. Returning to the campsite the next day, we discovered that part of the campground had been closed due to a small tornado that had torn through the area during the same night. Trees lay strewn across the roads, obstructing our path. We could only wonder if the tornado had passed through while we were there or shortly after our departure. Regardless, we swiftly packed up our campsite and departed, leaving behind a haunting memory of one of the most powerful and frightening storms we had ever witnessed. And, as an unfortunate bonus, my sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. We have a tradition of embarking on 3 to 5 mile hikes deep into the heart of Georgia's wilderness. One chilly autumn night, the temperature took an unexpected dive into the low 20s, a rarity for that time of year. With a hearty meal in our bellies and a robust fire crackling away, we settled in, the warmth and fullness lulling us into a contented slumber. My peaceful rest was interrupted when my buddy gently tapped my foot with a stick. I looked over, and he motioned silently towards the fire. To our astonishment, 2 wild boars were bustling around the dwindling flames. Armed with nothing more than a hand axe, but with the weapon out of reach, my friend and I lay there in absolute silence, our hearts pounding as we observed these formidable creatures for what felt like an eternity. It was only when the fire had finally succumbed to darkness that the boars moved on. For those unfamiliar, wild boars in Georgia are robust, weighing in at around 150 pounds, and they tend to have a perpetually irritable disposition, making them prone to charging and attacking almost anything that crosses their path. Looking back, we counted ourselves exceedingly fortunate that we hadn't spooked them that night. My family used to go camping every summer when I was growing up. We usually bounced between Virginia Beach, Assateague Island, and this rather infamous place called Westmoreland. One memorable trip took us to Assateague, near the beach, where we had set up 2 tents in different parts of the campsite. One night, in the middle of our peaceful slumber, my mother suddenly woke up, which naturally roused me from my sleep. She sat up straight, completely motionless, and I followed her gaze to see what had caught her attention. Bathed in the soft moonlight, there was the silhouette of what appeared to be an old woman peering into our tent, her hair appearing long and wiry. Being quite young at the time, this sight terrified me, and I began bombarding my mom with questions about who was outside our tent. As I made noise, it startled the old woman, and she quickly darted away. That's when we realized that what we had seen was not a person but one of the feral ponies that roamed freely on the island. We had unwittingly set up our tent on one of their trails, and they were on their way to the beach.